morning, Warsaw. Today is Sunday, 10 September. It will be mostly cloudy with highs of 15 degrees Celsius or 59 degrees Fahrenheit for our American listeners. Sunrise will be at 6:18 a.m. and sunset at 7:20 p.m. We are on the 41st day of the Warsaw Uprising. And I hear a very famous poet dies on this day, but otherwise, what else is happening?
Yes, Philippe, he does, and I will come back to his story a little bit later in the podcast. But first, let's start with what's really more or less happening on the ground. So, with the defeat of the Powiśle district, with the defeat of the Old Town, the Germans are now concentrating their actions and their attacks further into Śródmieście, so the Midtown district, also on the Mokotów district as well, which is still standing. So these are the next districts that are going to be heavily under attack. So of course we have bombings that are happening constantly throughout these districts, and also heavy fighting, especially over individual houses on Nowy Świat, so New World Street, and Napoleon Square. And for those of you who ever do go on a tour with me, you'll be able to see the most beautiful photographs of what Napoleon Square used to look like. Not nowadays. Nowadays it's horrifically ugly and just very communistic. But before that, at this time period, Napoleon Square was absolutely stunning, with a beautiful garden in the middle and very old 1920s and even before 1920s buildings standing around it. So this is the area that's being under attack. All of these areas are very close together, and the Germans now try and storm the main post office. We spoke about this way at the beginning. I think it was in episode 1 or 2 or 3, one of those. We spoke about the main post office and the capture. So the Germans are storming this main post office, but they don't hold it for very long. Why? Because the insurgents drive them out with the counterattack. So we are now moving to, just like we did in the Old Town, we are moving to building by building, floor by floor, room by room. So the Germans are also desperate to capture Aleja Jerozolimskia, or Jerusalem Avenue. That is where that big, huge barricade is. And it is also that connection, the east to west connection. So it is where the Germans can access the River Vistula or the River Wisła. And they need it. They need it at all costs. And they see it as their possible evacuation route. So they are fighting again over every single house. And these fights are continuing 24 hours, continuous fighting over these houses, over this ground, anything that they can gain. And the insurgents are trying to hold strong, and they do for the time being. But the Germans are also doing other things, as well as their Home Army Command. And I'm going to let Claire take this over, because what is happening between the Home Army Command and the German command? Where are we with all of this?
So obviously there's heavy fighting continuing even at this point. And just to give a flavour of what that feels like on the ground, I interviewed a wonderful woman some years ago, actually now, and wrote an article about her testimony. Hanna Czarnocka. She was a 16-year-old during the Warsaw Uprising. She was part of the teams of young women who had been scavenging for all sorts of supplies. She was sent out to find medical supplies if there was anything left across the city. And she had actually successfully managed to find 10 glass bottles full of methylated spirits, which they could use as antiseptic. And she was returning with them when there was another bombardment. We don't know the exact date of this incident, but it was in this part of September. She later described to me how she heard the Stuka aircraft engine, and then she heard a whistle and a rumble and a shake and a rush of air. And as she looked around, everything around her started to collapse and then began to burn. And the Luftwaffe at that point, they were dropping incendiaries. Now, she was carrying those 10 glass bottles in a kind of homemade rucksack on her back. And suddenly there was all this flying debris everywhere, and some of the shrapnel smashed one of the bottles on her back. And she said that she suddenly felt that this meth, obviously very flammable, this methylated spirits, through the broken bottle, soak through her rucksack and through her shirt on her back. And it was this strangely cold feeling, because in that heat of the street, in that incendiary bombing raid, it started to evaporate in the hot air. And essentially, she thought, basically, she herself was a petrol bomb at this point. You know, there she was with 9 more of the bottles on her, and she herself was any spark, anything to touch her, and she would be set alight. So she managed to struggle on, but she did say She told me at that point, I realised I was going to die. But she managed to struggle on through the ruined street, climbing over bits, jumping off broken buildings, and eventually made it back to her base. And as she didn't die, she actually survived the uprising. But she was apparently given a right earful for breaking one of those bottles. You know, that was the worst of the situation there, because they were so desperate for the supplies. But that just gives you a flavour of, we talk about the bombing, we talk about the ongoing battles, but this is what it feels like. For the bigger picture, on the 10th of September, the Home Army is now, well, it's continuing to negotiate around the terms of a capitulation or a ceasefire. Well, they've had a number of short ceasefires. A lot of the civilian population have now been evacuated out, being processed through that Pruszków transit camp. And it's now that the Home Army commander sends a letter to the Germans with their terms for capitulation. This is what they're asking for. They say, the insurgents demand a guarantee of security for the partisans, the civilian population, and the civil authorities. I do like the use of the word demand there. And they state that no further negotiations will be possible until the Germans list the details of a guarantee for this in writing. So at 11 o'clock that morning, General Ruhr gives these guarantees. They're sent back, but he's also got demands of his own. He demands that the insurgents surrender by 4 o'clock that afternoon. And in a counter bid, the insurgents demand that these guarantees are confirmed by another general, General Reinhardt. So you can see there is this sort of toing and froing. And essentially at this point, the Poles they're playing for time. They're not prepared to surrender that afternoon. They are still fighting, as even the Germans have conceded at this point. They are fighting with huge determination. And yet, having said that, there is this, the civilians are moving out. They know it's potentially a battle for the death at this point. And morale, they're defiant, but morale is also low. And ironically, just as they need their great morale, this is the day that the great Polish poet, who has been an author, a lyricist, has written many of the songs that have kept morale going through the uprising. This is the day that he is killed.
One of my favourite songs of all time of the uprising was written by Józef Szczepański, and he wrote Pałacyk Michla. So I'm going to read you the Polish version, which is Pałacyk Michla, żytnia wola, bronią się chłopcy od parasola, choć na tygrysy mają wisy, to warszawaki fajne chłopaki są. So I really wanted to sing that, and I apologise only because nobody wants to hear me sing, but it translates to Michla's Palace, żytnia wola. Michla's Palace was a tenement house, an Art Nouveau palace built by one of the Michla family, and behind it was a mill, a bakery and a pasta factory. And this building was attacked by the Parasol Battalion, of which Szczepański was part of, on the 5th of August. And shortly after this attack, Szczepański wrote this poem and this song. The song continues, the boys defend themselves from under the umbrella. Parasol, Battalion Parasol being umbrella, so he's talking about the umbrella battalion here specifically. They have their visas on the tigers, tiger tanks, for example, and vis was a type of pistol that the insurgents used. My granddad specifically ended up using a vis as well, specifically during the occupation. And the last line, to warszawiaki fajne chłopaki są. They are Varsovians, the amazing boys that they are. I love this song. I sing it loud and proud, even though I cannot sing for the life of me. But he's also written so many different poems and so many different songs that have been repeated, that are still sung to this day. We've got to remember during the 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s and some of the 90s, you weren't allowed to sing these songs, especially in Poland. Songs like this were banned. Anyway, moving on to who he was. He fought in the Wola district. So Żytnia is one of the streets, Wola is the district. And from Wola they moved to the Old Town. And then when the Old Town fell, obviously, I'll tell you in a minute what happened. He is evacuated to the Midtown, the Śródmieście district. These insurgents, various other insurgents, remember him as an exceptionally brave soldier. He was an amazing friend and a very, very, very good shot. During the occupation, he was part of the Kiev section of the Home Army, which would liquidate, basically execute various different high-ranking German officials. He even went to Kraków to go and do one of these. Unfortunately, the mission was not successful, but he did also take part in one of the most famous and well-known missions in Warsaw in February. So come for a tour with me. I'll tell you all about it. On the 18th and 21st of August, while he was fighting in the Old Town, he was awarded the Cross of Valour, and then posthumously he was awarded the Vitutto Militari Cross, which is the highest order in England. It is like the Victoria Cross. His poems more or less give an idea or chronicle the battles of the Parasol Battalion. So if you go back and you get a chance to read some of these poems, you'll be able to get a bit of an idea of what it was like for the Parasol Battalion. Even though we might not necessarily have as many diaries from the exact moment, this is as close as we can get. So on the night of the 30th to 31st of August, he takes part in an unsuccessful attempt to break through from the old town to the city centre. I did talk about this. If you go back about a week, you'll be able to hear a little bit more about that. A day later, he's appointed the group commander, and this is where it all goes wrong. He is shot in the groin, stomach and thigh. Now, there's several versions of what happened. It's difficult to assess which one of them is actually true. But according to one of the stories is that he may have been accidentally shot by an unknown soldier of his battalion who was operating a machine gun. The machine gun jammed and he misfired. And the wounds were so severe. He was taken to a hospital. When the hospital became bombed, he was evacuated through the sewers alongside many other wounded. And then he was transferred to a field hospital on Marszałkowska Street, which is one of the big major routes from north to south. And then he dies. He dies on the 10th of September as a result of his wounds, and he was buried in a makeshift grave in the courtyard of the tenement house of where the field hospital was. So after the war, his remains are identified. He's exhumed at the end of 1945, and he's buried in Powązki Cemetery. What's really interesting is in 2020, some of his poems appeared and some correspondence were donated to Akt Nowych, the archive, and they were donated by two brothers, and they found them in the memoirs, their mother's memoirs, Halina Kolbińska, and she was his love. And they met in 1939 as students, and his poems, his letters show that it was love at first sight, well, on his part anyway. So Halina at the beginning wasn't quite sure how she felt about him, and he won her heart very quickly with his poems, his words, and they were crazy in love with each other. They planned for the future, and they wrote to each other often, especially in the summer of 1939. And of course, the war broke out. They went in two completely different directions. They wrote to each other, but that's about as far as it went, really. So we do have some of his unpublished poetry in the archives, which is incredible. He is known as one of the most outstanding poets of his generation, alongside Baczyński, who we spoke about, who died in the first few days of the Warsaw Uprising. You know, him as well. He was madly in love with his wife too, and I think love brings out this sort of powerful words, but it's heartbreaking. He was never given the opportunity to fully develop his amazing talent, because he, like many other poets, artists, musicians, doctors, professors, people of the intelligentsia class, were either murdered during the occupation or lost their lives in things like the Warsaw Uprising. So moving on to what's been happening on the ground, we have quite a few airdrops that happen on this day as well. So I'm going to go through them really quickly. So we have the Liberator of the Polish air squadron. It was shot down by the German Air Force over a town in Yugoslavia. Most of the crew managed to jump out of the plane, but 3 of them end up being killed. They're buried in the British military cemetery in Belgrade. There's another Polish air squadron who on this day ends up crashing in an emergency landing near another village in Yugoslavia. The entire aircrew died. And another Polish air squadron, they do actually successfully make an airdrop, but on their way back to Brindisi over Yugoslavia, they're fired upon by the Germans and attacked by a night fighter at the same time. But they most of the crew, actually all of the crew, managed to jump out of the damaged aeroplane and parachuted out very safely. The following one is another Liberator by the 31st South African Air Squadron. Again, these guys, they circled Warsaw just for too long, looking for favourable conditions to drop, because this night it was dark, there was thick smoke, and they finally did their drop, but these guys ran out of fuel over Yugoslavia. They were ordered to evacuate, and only 2, including one being an RAF crew member, managed to escape out. The rest of the crew died, and they're also buried in the British military cemetery in Belgrade. And finally, the RAF 148 squadron at Halifax, it's shot down near a town in Hungary. On their way to Warsaw, the entire crew managed to parachute out and get themselves to safety. So we still are having airdrops by the British, by the South Africans, by the Polish Air Force, and they're still continuing flying from Brindisi all the way to Warsaw and then all the way back. The bravery of these pilots, of these aircrew, is so phenomenal that we can only say thank you for what you did. Thank you to the ones that gave their lives, and thank you to the ones that risked their lives. So, talking about all these brave Allied crew members and brave Allied pilots, and Polish, of course, they're seeming to risk their lives. Now, when are the Soviets actually going to do something? Is it today that there is a change made? Is it today that something does happen on the Soviet side?
No, we've got the long-awaited Soviet assault on Warsaw begins on the 10th of September. It's tempting to say, as we heard earlier on, that the insurgents themselves are sort of playing for time to some extent by opening negotiations. But you can see from the Soviet response, after all that pressure from, most notably from Churchill and others, but that pressure on them to actually, do something to assist the insurgents in Warsaw, or to allow the Western allies to assist more effectively. One could argue that they've finally given in to that pressure, or one could, if one were of a sort of cynical mindset, or perhaps just you understand how cynical the Soviets were. One can see perhaps that this is them changing tack to as a sop to their Western allies, perhaps to string along the insurgents for a bit longer, to in the hope that maybe a few more insurgents will be killed against the Germans. There are various interpretations one can put on this, but the bottom line is that the Soviets begin their attack on Warsaw. So on the ground, they attack Praga in the east, so beyond to the east of the Vistula, ground attack against Praga. And in the air, as you say, there are Soviet air raids on the two airfields in the west of Warsaw, so Bielany up in the north and Okęcie in the south. Okęcie, incidentally, is the modern Chopin airport in Warsaw. That's the site of it. Up until comparatively recently, it was called Okęcie, so that sort of rings bells with me. First time I flew into it, it was still called Okęcie. So the Soviets has finally moved. One of the units that's very prominent in that, it all fell under the first Belarusian front, which was the way they'd sort of organised their military fronts in the Red Army. But one of the units involved in that was the 1st Tadeusz Kościuszko Infantry Division, which is the sort of primary unit of the Berling Army, which we've mentioned before. And it's worth just sort of mentioning again who they were. The Berling Army was set up by the Soviets on Soviet soil, but using predominantly Polish soldiers. So these are soldiers who had, to a large extent, they are the Poles that had been deported eastwards in 1940 and 1941 during that 22-month period of German-Soviet collaboration under the Nazi-Soviet Pact, where the Germans had been busy deporting Poles every which way, both into the Reich for labour and, within the general government, shifting people around. Massive movements of people was kind of what these totalitarian powers did. While the Germans are doing that, the Soviets were busy sifting the populations of eastern Poland that they had taken over. And anyone that looked at them askance or was, a member of, the educated classes, or someone who had transgressed in any possible imaginable way, generally the sentence generally was deportation to the east. So people tended to get, we reckon it's up to about 1 million people are deported eastwards into the gulag camps and into the collective farms of both Siberia and Kazakhstan. Those are the usual places that people ended up. A lot of those that we know, and this is something that's very well known to students of Polish history, about 115,000 of those got out with the Anders Army, which came out in the end in 1942, and they came out via Persia and then into Palestine, were reorganised and became the Polish army that fought up through Italy through 1943 and 44. So large proportion came out that way. Those that didn't make it to the Anders Army tended to be sort of reorganised and put into this, what became known as the Berling Army, under a general called Zygmunt Berling, again a Pole who had escaped the fate of other Polish generals and senior officers at Katyn by basically being sympathetic to communism and to Soviet aims, or at least giving that impression to his interrogators. So his life was spared, and they thought, well, we can use this chap. So they set him up to head this Polish army under Soviet command. So that becomes the core of the Berling Army, which then appears initially further south in the autumn of 1944, initially at the bridgehead at Magnuszew, for example, to the south of Warsaw. And then it's moved up to the east of Warsaw to Praga in early September. And this is part of those Soviet forces that then attack the remnants of German forces on the eastern side of the Vistula. So it's very significant. Again, all of this is sort of playing to propaganda purposes from the Soviet side. It's highly desirable for their propaganda to have Polish forces, admittedly under their control, but Polish forces liberating what remained of Warsaw. I did liberating in inverted commas, but it's highly significant that they had Polish forces to liberate what remained of Warsaw. So hence that's why they moved to that front, and that's why they played an important part in that assault on the German forces to the east of Warsaw. So again, quite a significant development in a lot of ways, not only for that propaganda significance I just mentioned, but also because this is the Soviets finally moving. Again, what motivates this, we can't be entirely clear, whether it's acquiescing to Western pressure, whether it's all part of the propaganda game, is not entirely clear. But it's a significant grand strategic moment in the history of the Warsaw Rising.
And it can't actually be unrelated, that shift in the Soviet attitude, the Soviet approach and involvement, to the fact that there are capitulation negotiations ongoing, that we're clearly winding down to the last moments of the defence of Warsaw, that they are preparing to come in and take that ground.
Yeah, this is where I also, you could read it another way as well, Claire. The cynic could say, well, if you can see, bear in mind that from the Soviet perspective, this is two enemies fighting it out, right, between the Poles and the Germans. And if you can see that winding down, best thing you can do is to keep them fighting. Right. So the best thing you can do is to sort of jump in with some of your forces and say, well, we'll come and help you. We'll come and help you, in a sense, to try and scupper those ceasefire negotiations. So if you're being cynical, you could interpret that as the motive behind that Soviet action. And it's not beyond the bounds of possibility.
I completely agree with you. And that theory would be backed up by the other big Stalin's sort of U-turn here, or not U-turn, but change development, is that it's on this day, the 10th of September, that he finally gives theoretical permission for the Allies to land their aircraft and refuel on Soviet-held territory, on the airfields, that have been held by the Allies. They are allies, but he's until this point been refusing to let them use. And you could say that this follows that rather sharp intervention you spoke about a couple of days ago from Churchill, when he demanded the use of airstrips immediately and criticised Stalin for not fulfilling his obligations as an ally, in regard to his supplying to the Poles. And perhaps Churchill's use of propaganda, which you discussed as well, just saying this doesn't reflect well on the international scene, that they need to start providing supplies themselves, or enabling supplies provisions to be sent in by the Allies in the West. Whatever his motivations are, from either side, the situation does change, and Molotov tells Churchill on this day that the Soviet government has agreed to provide air bases for both British and American planes. Now, that won't lead to immediate change. It takes some time before we get a renewal of the drops, and then it's pretty dramatic when it happens. But the Soviets have also agreed at this point to start making their own drops, and I think that is the bit that really feeds into your theory, Roger. Here they are providing, I've got to say, agreeing to provide a fairly minimal amount of military support to the Poles, really, when they're beyond hope, to be honest. At this point, how much benefit are they going to get from those supplies? And when the supplies have made, well, we'll cross that bridge when it happens. It doesn't happen for 2 or 3 days yet. But it is a really interesting shift in Soviet policy at this point, both on the ground, as you've been talking about, but also the air policy as well.
Yeah, there's an interesting development on the German side on the 10th of September, which is that the local Wehrmacht commander in Warsaw, who's Heinz Reinefahrt, sends in an application to his superiors for Oscar de Levanger to be presented with the Knight's Cross. The Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross was not necessarily the highest award, but it's a very high award for military merit in the Third Reich. Basically an enlarged Iron Cross, which is worn at the throat on a ribbon around the neck. Very much sought after by all sort of senior commanders. They used to describe those most ambitious commanders of the German military as having a sore throat because they were so in need of having this thing around their neck. So that was kind of soldiers' slang for an ambitious and sometimes very reckless commander who just didn't matter how many lives he sacrificed, he just wanted to get the Knight's Cross. Anyway, on this day, Reinefeld sent in an application for Oscar de Levanger, that one of the most notorious commanders on the ground in Warsaw, who had of course been the commander of the 36th Waffen-SS Grenadier Division, known colloquially as the De Levanger Brigade, for him to receive the Knight's Cross. And again, just bear in mind, he was the man, along with others, but his troops were among those who had committed some of the worst atrocities in the Warsaw Rising, the massacres at Ochota and Wola, and the massacre that followed the fall of the Old Town around the 1st of September. So absolutely, blood on his hands in huge amounts, one of the most hideous characters. And yet this application talks about how, and I quote, "he has proven through his many exploits that he is one of the bravest among the brave." And in a supporting note by SS Obergruppenführer Erich von den Bach, who again we've talked about a lot, concurs in that in praising de Levanger, and says that the successes achieved in Warsaw are in the first place to the personal merit of SS Oberführer de Levanger, who with his personal courage and aggressiveness is a shining example for his soldiers. And one can only wonder, if he was a shining example, who are the bad examples to German soldiers in this time?
Well, that's the end of episode 41. Thank you so much for joining us. And we gave you a slightly longer one today rather than yesterday, a little bit shorter, but they will move. Some will be 20 minutes, some will be 15 minutes, some will be 10. So you've got a bit of a listening job today. We will see you tomorrow for day 42. And remember, if you like us, rate us on your favourite listening platform. We want to get those ratings and we want to be seen by more people. So this will help us very much. Thanks so much, guys. We'll see you tomorrow.